my plane doesn't leave for a while. Yes, yes. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with David Horowitz and at all?
Yeah, I know David Horowitz. Why?
Well, there's this concept.
Does everybody know David Horowitz? Anybody who doesn't? David Horowitz used to be the editor of Ramparts, one of the editors, and he drove it into the ground. And he and his buddy Peter Conyers went from being radicals, publishers of the Ramparts, to becoming right-wingers, you know. They decided there wasn't going to be a revolution in the left, and some of us said, okay, you can abandon that position, but why do you have to go and support Ronald Reagan? There's no place else on the political spectrum. And they have, and David Horowitz has gotten duly rewarded for that. He has his own institution, he gets on Fox networks, he gets here and there, and he's a pain in the ass. So that's my measured view of David Horowitz. But why do you ask?
I was just wondering, in the modern day when people like that are comparing these social programs to socialism, what's the hope of actually achieving socialism? Like you say, this is socialism kind of, but is it more of a social program, being in a university, being in a school? And
well, that's the whole point. That's what I mean about Christianity. There's no shortage of people going to get up and say, that's not really socialism. That's not really it. Socialism is this other thing. Yeah, well, but this might be a real practice and step toward that other, more complete society. And there's no reason why you can't do what they're doing in Cuba right now, which is allowing people to start personal businesses, you know, and limiting how many, you know, how big that business can become. That's another point. I mean, seriously limiting it. You know, they already had a private business. I was just there 2 years ago. They already, you know what the private business was? That they couldn't stop it. It was, what do you call it? Beauticians. Women dealing with their hair. You know, you can't mess with women. The Roman Republic the Roman Empire had problems with that, with the Roman matrons, where they came out and took direct political action. It was an anti-luxury practice and told these women they couldn't dress this way and they couldn't do this and do that. And they said, "Who the hell are you?" And it was quite a fight. But I mean, there was no fight down there. But they're doing things now that are okay. By the way, that was also tried in Vietnam, and it's terrible what resulted. It became a whole nation of shopkeepers. Everybody, there's shops. Every street, almost every major street, there's shops and people selling. Everybody wants to own a store. It was the most discouraging, dismaying thing I ever saw, especially for those of us who sacrificed our careers on the Vietnam War and all that stuff. So your point is what? That's not really socialism? Is that what you're saying?
well, technically, yeah. I guess that would be my opinion. But
I agree.
my more question would be, how do we hope to achieve any form of socialism, taking kind of a reformist line rather than a revolutionary line?
No, you can take a revolutionary line and you can start pointing out how the reformist socialist practices that we do achieve and develop have a revolutionary impact. That's what these guys are afraid of. They're not afraid that you're going to have a little public fire department. They're afraid that you're going to wake up one day and say, hey, this socialist fire department is better than a private, for-profit fire department. A for-profit fire department will come up and say, sorry, you haven't, geez, that's quite a blaze. You haven't kept up your payments though, so we really can't put out your fire. Too bad for you. That's not such a joke. That's what our medical system is about. Say, gee, you know, too bad we can't take care of your cancer or your this or that because you haven't kept up your payments. So that becomes a way of bringing it home to people. You know, I once had a whole brochure I wrote on socialism. This was also in Vermont, and a worker I knew, bunch of workers did. And he read this thing. He said, "You know what, Doc?" He says, "I agree with every single thing in this. This is terrific, except this socialism you hear on the bottom." He was afraid of the word. I said, "But that's what all these things are, Harry. That's what socialism is. All these things." What do you mean? What do you mean? And you realize people have been wired in their head to have these labels, and we shouldn't sling the labels around without explanation and without illustration of it, so that they can see. But why did you bring up David Horowitz? What's that got to do with this?
David Horowitz, as in demonizing these social programs as socialism. So he demonizes, for example, healthcare as socialism, and pushing that tide back so far, it seems that the real gains we actually want to gain, universal healthcare, a classless society, are almost insurmountable, unaccomplishable, given the fact that we're putting our own mark for socialism so far low, so far down.
Well, okay, but I'm not saying you got to then say, "Yay, we've achieved socialism" if we get a public option or single payer or something. In fact, single payer isn't even socialism. It's a kind of insurance. I think it's the government paying out to the insurance company. We want a public option.
National Health Service.
What? Was your hand up next? You wanted?
Oh yeah, I just had a comment. As someone with an amateur interest in history, it's easy to notice the further back in history you go, the more, well, there's always aristocratic bias, but the less this bias is answered, the further back in history you go. So I just want to say I really appreciate the book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar. I think it's fantastic.
Great. He's got a copy of it, and he held it up. Did you
Well,
get that on
like
camera? No, you're just sitting there, right? But I didn't get what you said before, that the more we go back in history,
The further you go back in history, the less that the conservative or aristocratic bias in history has been answered, or the less people are conscious of it. So like,
right, and that's what I discovered.
Back to antiquity.
Yeah, that's what I discovered in writing the book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, that present-day historians have the exact same opinion as the early classical ones, and they all have a class bias, and it's never discussed that way. No one ever says, "Oh, Plutarch had class biases," or Dio Cassius, or Appian, but they did. Who wrote history in those days? It was the very rich patricians who wrote it, and they wrote it from a certain perspective. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and so like you said something like 95% of modern day ancient historians are Ciceronians, whereas thinking about, it's, even though their conservatism is very strong today, I wouldn't say it's 95% of his 20th century historians are ultra conservatives, but that would be the equivalent.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
So I have two quick questions. One was to clarify that when you brought up the plumbers in Cuba, you were discussing that there's a lot of issues around them not really being able to accomplish the jobs that they're supposed to, or them taking a long time to actually to get jobs done. Is that what one of the problems with plumbers in Cuba is?
That they had problems of getting jobs done? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, being able to actually come out on a timely basis to solve people's problems.
Things got done. Things got done in the Soviet Union. There were books, there was clothing, there was great public transportation. You see, every existing communist or socialist country has been attacked. There's not a single one, Nicaragua, under the Sandinistas, you can go back, there's not a single one that's ever been allowed to develop socialism. They've all been attacked. They all end up, what happened in the Soviet Union was siege socialism. It was, the first years were this life and death struggle of the Civil War, 14 nations invading the Soviet Union. This was followed 20 years of forced industrialization, with the invasion by the Nazi Germany. every country, every one of these countries, Cuba today has been living under this boycott and blockade for decades. They feel it, they still feel it. They have never been allowed a natural development. So many of the problems felt by these various reformists, socialists, whatever else, they have all been attacked. They've all been Michael Manley in Jamaica, Aristide, President Aristide in Haiti. I mean, we're talking about getting killed, getting removed from office, getting smashed, getting bombed, getting invaded and destroyed, or getting starved out by boycotts and sanctions. So how can anybody say that socialism doesn't work? And much of the discontent, my feeling in Cuba, is because of the kind of strangulation they've been living under for a long time. But the question you're raising is about worker discipline, is that it?
Yeah, and mainly I feel like that's an argument that capitalists often use, saying, oh, well, look at the workers in the Soviet Union, and it's been...
They just goofed off.
Yeah, and I feel that quite often.
And by the way, that's a legitimate... I have a chapter in Black Shirts and Reds. It's called Communism in Wonderland. I'm referring over there to Josh because he bought a copy of the book. It's called... yeah, there are all sorts of goof-ups and those things, and one could learn from those things. And it's a disappointing thing that the Communist Party USA has not critically looked at this period. They just said mistakes were made. Well, what is that? Mistakes are always made in every society about everything. That's not enough explanation. What's the problem that certain things didn't work? But a lot of things did work. So my position is I take a differential object appraisal, I think it's called in sociology, which is you look at the thing not as one colossus and one wicked force or something. You look at it with many multi-factored things that are involved, multidimensional areas, and what works and what doesn't work. It's a bit more complex than our ideologies are. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you. I'd like to comment, if I may, but first, if I could just say that you were one of the biggest inspirations for me to go into academia back in the 80s, study political economy, etc. So I thank you. And I can't believe that the RSU and y'all brought Michael Parenti to our campus. It's just remarkable. So I'm grateful, and now I'm on the faculty here.
Will your students forgive me for having...
I hope so.
Okay.
It really is.
Good. Yes.
I've been trying to emulate your work.
Thank you. That's very nice.
And now that I'm here, I'm just frequently terrified that some fundamentalist, gun-toting wacko is going to shoot me down in front of the classroom. But one of the things that keeps me going is the fact that you're still around, and no one's taking you out or Wendell-Berries or
I got stories.
Do you have, that's what I was curious about. Do you have stories?
Well,
do you need a bodyguard? Do you worry about those things?
No, I've gotten threatening letters and things, I got a letter once from a woman that said, "Sir, you are like a skunk at a garden party." I just howled and laughed at her. And she said, "Why don't you go back to the country your father came from?" And I said, "What, the Bronx? Do I have to?" I get surveilled, tapped my phone. I had one day the phone rang and it was a woman, and her voice was very much like, it was a rather close imitation, but I knew it wasn't the same person, of the voice of a woman I had just been talking to 2 hours before, who was a friend of mine up in Seattle, and we meet every so often, and we were saying personal things on the phone. And she starts repeating the same phrases and such. So that could only have been someone who was tapping into the conversation. So that's when they're passing from surveillance to harassment. And another time, a guy's voice came on and started saying things about me. And I've been under surveillance in Berkeley too. I remember having a car follow me and another one. They were really trying to, but that seems to have tapered off now. But no one's taken a shot at me. Although I was on a demonstration in San Francisco, and we were marching down one street, and I looked up, and there was this row of office buildings, and there were a couple of windows open. All the windows are closed, but there were like 3 windows open, and in one window was a guy standing there, and he was staring right at me, and we had like direct eye contact, and I looked at him, and I said, "Whoa, what does that guy want?" I took a few more steps, and I looked back up, and there was no one in the window, and I turned this way, and then a pool ball came flying right and just missed my head by inches, and luckily there was enough space. There was a woman walking there. It hit the ground, but it could have hit her in the leg or something. And I always wondered about that one. I mean, if they wanted to take me out, they would use less crude methods than that. They have ways of killing you,
So I'll stop worrying.
What?
I'll stop worrying so much.
No, keep worrying about yourself. Don't underestimate these creepos. You never know. Be careful. Anybody else on a curious subject? Do we? Yeah.
You mentioned the environment and ecosystems a couple of times. I'm wondering if you think that there are features in socialist political economy which make it less likely to commodify natural resources in a capitalist system. The reason I ask this is that I teach environmental ethics, and many times we're studying how in a capitalist political economy natural resources are commodified, and but then students will bring our class's attention to the Soviet Union and China, who don't have good records on the environment either.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you believe that socialism is more environmentally friendly than capitalism, or not? Is it industrialism that is the root fundamental cause to devote to either political economy?
I think socialism can be more friendly than capitalism. Capitalism cannot be, unless it's forced, unless there's some real pressure and regulation and some counterforce from government agencies. But you know, you can't regulate everything that these guys do. They're all over the world doing things left and right. And in the case of the Soviet Union and China too, that they were, as I was saying earlier, they were under siege, and people coming to power. Lenin talked about this. How do we hold state power? How do we survive in this world, and how do we retain our humanity while doing that? And they found they had to start doing all sorts of things. The Nicaraguans, when they took over, the Sandinistas, when they took over in Nicaragua, they discovered they had to start doing all sorts of things they didn't want to do, like form a security police and a secret police intelligence service. They needed that. The Bolsheviks had an excellent intelligence service in the Soviet Union, and that's exactly what happens. Their natural resources became commodified in the sense of they had to build up an army, they had to build up a whole industrial base east of the Urals, which saved them when Hitler came along and almost made it to the Urals. So they had to start doing all sorts of things that had nothing to do with socialism, but had everything to do with survival. And so in that sense, it had a terribly distorting effect. And then a lot of it may just be ignorance. That's true. We discovered that when a socialist party comes to state power, which hasn't happened very often, they do not automatically discard their views about women. They do not automatically discard their views about this minority or not that minority. Again, Lenin, I didn't know I was going to quote him that often. He said, scratch a Bolshevik and you find a Russian chauvinist, you know. But I didn't find that. I remember when I went, there was a real consciousness about, in Yugoslavia, the same thing, a real consciousness, especially among the Serbs. They were the least nationalists of the groups. They were the most, and that's why they were targeted. They were the most committed to keeping a federation. And people do learn. We learned it here in our own country about racism. I'm old enough to remember, I mean, movies that were, today would be utterly totally racist, you know. The only people you saw in movies was Stepin Fetchit and Aunt Jemima and, you know, and Sambo and tap dancers or something, and that was it. So there have been tremendous changes, but those changes didn't come because of name me the capitalist who said and fought or devoted some kind of energy to fighting racism. They didn't do that. In fact, they opposed civil rights. They saw it as an equalizing force. They saw it as something that's going to make demands on their ability to manipulate the workforce and play off group against group. So I would say that there has to be a lot of conscious struggle done along with the victories in the political economy to educate ourselves on it. Gay rights is another example. In Cuba years ago, they were totally, you know, they wouldn't allow gays to teach at school. For some reason they thought gays were all pedophiles, you know. I mean, we used to go down and argue with them, and that's all changed now. That's all improved. Their attitude toward gays is much more live and let live and acceptance than you find in a lot of communities in America. But it doesn't automatically happen. So you could make an argument for, and that'd be a good thing to study too, cultural struggle under socialism. You know, does that answer? Does that give you some answer at all?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. I never.
It's a complex issue.
I start taking off on what I'm thinking about. Then I say, did I answer the question? Yeah.
Well, with regard to what you were just saying, don't you think that most active socialist movements already, are imbued with ecological awareness? I mean, so Cuba, right, being one of the only sustainable countries in the world, or Bolivia, enshrining the rights of Mother Earth in their constitution, or the Nepali Maoists, who in their proposed constitution guarantee everyone a right to a healthy environment.
Yeah, that's a good point. That would more directly answer you, I think, in a more informed way, that there are revolutionary and established communist movements, socialist movements that have that.
I did not know that. That's excellent.
Yeah, in Cuba they recycle plastic bottles, but they still got plastic bottles and all. Yeah.
My personal view on that is that it's the industrial political economy that is the root fundamental cause of environmental degradation. In the capitalist political economy, it's exacerbated. But there's a danger, but it's not as if a non-communist, a non-capitalist political economy is automatically going to be environmentally friendly.
Right, absolutely, we agree.
It's something that has to be worked for, and
consciously struggle.
Industrial political economy has to be mitigated, even in socialism. Socialism in and of itself doesn't have the structural features to be environmentally friendly, but the possibility is there.
Especially, and I said, it doesn't have the features, especially when you desperately need to build up a security force and an army,
exactly.
and you're being attacked on four sides. You're not going to think about preserving this beautiful forest. China is a terrible example. I mean, and your question speaks directly to China. I mean, the toxicity, the destruction of certain beautiful rivers.
Yeah.
I mean, there's cancer. These villages along these rivers are turning into cancer alleys, and a lot of that is just ignorance. A lot of that is like not knowing about it, or a lot of it is meeting the plan. It's just pressure from up there, and you meet the plan. And, well, I don't know. But it's a good point you raised, and it really has to be dealt with. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you very much.